St. Augustine is recognized not only as one of the great intellectuals of the Christian church in the history of Christianity, but also one of the great intellectuals in the history of the world. And his books, of course, are written clearly from a Christian theological point of view. And it's also been recognized, though, that his books do offer thoughts that are more broadly applicable. At the heart of this short book on Christian teaching, there seem to be two questions. One, how can I be a good reader of the Bible? Secondly, how can I be a good teacher of the Bible? And related to those questions are broader questions. How can I be a good reader? If I want to be a good reader of the Bible, then that seems to imply, first of all, that I need to be a good reader. And the second point, if I want to be a good teacher of the Bible, that seems to imply then I need to be a good teacher. And Augustine offers interesting thoughts on these themes. Let's look at a quote from fairly early in the book. Augustine says that a person is at his best when in his whole life he strives toward the unchangeable form of life and holds fast to it wholeheartedly. Now, in the translation we have here, the masculine pronoun is used, his best, his whole life, etc. We understand this is more broadly applicable to everyone. But a person is at his best when in his whole life he strives toward the unchangeable form of life and holds fast to it wholeheartedly. If he loves himself on his own account, he does not relate himself to God, but turns to himself and not to something unchangeable. So one of the things that we see, we have the word unchangeable twice, and then there's a reference to God. And in Augustine's mind, these two things are the same thing. What is unchangeable in the universe? In this world we live in, everything is changeable. The weather's changeable, our bodies are changeable, everything is changeable. But there is something unchangeable in the universe, and that is God. And so Augustine is saying that we should strive toward the unchangeable form of life. In other words, strive toward God, right? Now, let's look at this, focus on this first sentence. A person is at his best when in his whole life he strives towards the unchangeable form of life. So we understand that Augustine means God here and holds fast to it wholeheartedly. Now, underpinning Augustine's thought here is the philosophy of the Greek philosopher Plato, who, offered ideas about sort of a realm of unchangeable perfect forms. And Augustine picks up on that, but he thinks about it in a Christian way. What Augustine is encouraging us to do is to remember that we are eternal beings. Of course, we're natural, decaying beings. In Genesis, we're told that human beings are a mix of dust and the breath of God. What are human beings made of? The natural stuff of the world and the breath of God. We are obviously the natural stuff, made of the natural stuff of the world, because our bodies can decompose and replenish the ground, right? We are made of the same stuff as the trees and the lizards, right? We are obviously natural beings, but Genesis says that human beings are also made of the breath of God. There's that eternal thing. And certainly from ancient times to the present, it does seem pretty clear that overwhelmingly human beings have perceived that there is something eternal within them, that there's something within them that's eternal that can be related to something external to them that is eternal. And I think this is what Augustine's getting at. And he's encouraging us to always remember that there's something unchangeable out there, and there's something within us that can relate to that unchangeable thing, right? And that's what we should do. In everything we do, we should try to relate ourselves to what's unchangeable. Relate our thinking to that, our reading to that, our teaching to that, our living to that, our conversations to that. Relate ourselves to what is unchangeable. So he said that, Augustine here, I think, is influenced by the Greek philosopher Plato as he's thinking about this idea of unchangeability. But I wanted to look at other similar ideas as well, at other ideas out there that relate to this concept of unchangeability. Let's look at this. This comes from a Christian text, from the very first verse in the Gospel of John in the New Testament. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, if you read this sentence literally and just say, okay, well, what does the sentence say? Then it's actually hard to know. Well, I mean, we can read what the sentence says, but what does it mean? This sentence really does require some interpretation, because on its face, just a simple plain reading, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. Well, what's the Word, right? Well, what is that? And Christians will have a ready response to that, but I'm just saying isolate that sentence by itself, and what does it mean? It requires interpretation. Well, that word, comes from the Greek word logos, which is a very complicated word. The Greek word logos has a lot of different meanings. Our word logic comes from it. The word logos can refer to the order of things. It can refer to reason. Our academic discipline, psychology, that logi part comes from logos. Anthropology, that comes from logos. We're using this word all of the time in English. It has a lot of different meanings. So let's look at some of the ways this word was thought about in the ancient world. We have this quote from Philo of Alexandria, who refers to the logos of God. We can think of this as kind of something emanating from God, sort of a power, a force almost, if we can think of it that way, sort of emanating from God. It was inscribed and engraved upon the constitution of all things, right? This is kind of something emanating from God that kind of suffuses the universe. If there's order, that's the logos at work. If there's reason, that's the logos at work. I think that's kind of the idea. Here's a quote from William Barclay, an important, influential scholar of the New Testament, who's writing about the ancient philosophical school of the Stoics. And he says that to the Stoics, this logos of God roamed through all things. There's this idea again that this kind of force, for lack of a better phrase, emanating from God, it kind of goes, it kind of suffuses the universe. The times, the seasons, the tides, the stars in their courses were ordered by the logos. The predictability of the rise and the setting of the sun, that's the logos. The predictability of weather based upon certain patterns, that's the logos. The order of mathematics, that's the logos. And then Berkeley goes on to say that according to the Stoics, the mind of man himself was a little portion of this logos. There's this idea that I think Augustine goes along with, that there's something eternal in us, that breath of God put into human beings, that mixes with the natural stuff of the world, so we are natural beings, but there's also something eternal within us that can tie into that eternal, unchangeable thing. This is what Augustine seems to be getting at. Plato seemed to have the same idea. Philo of Alexandria had this idea. The Stoics seem to have this idea. Let's look at something different. Ma'at, ancient Egypt. What was Ma'at? Here's what the British Museum's Dictionary of Ancient Egypt says about this concept of Ma'at that the ancient Egyptians had. Ma'at represented the divine order of the universe as originally brought into being at the moment of creation. It was the power of Ma'at that was believed to regulate the seasons, the movement of the stars, and the relations between man and gods. Notice how similar that is to what we get from Berkeley referring to the Stoics. The Logos, Ma'at, what Augustine refers to as that thing that's unchangeable in the universe, which he relates to God. In The Abolition of Man, the Christian thinker C.S. Lewis focuses on a concept called the Tao, or the Tao. And this comes from Chinese thought. And here's a definition of the Tao. It is the absolute principle underlying the universe, combining within itself the principles of yin and yang, sort of opposites, hot, cold, love, hate, and signifying the way or code of behavior that is in harmony with the natural order. So it's a little bit different from what we read about the Logos, but fundamentally similar though. This idea that there's an underlying principle. There's an underlying principle at work in the universe that relates to the natural world, that relates to human beings, right? The Stoics had this idea. It seems like the ancient Egyptians had this idea of Ma'at. Chinese philosopher, the idea of the Tao. And Lewis sort of discusses this concept. He relates his own thinking to this concept in his book, The Abolition of Man. I think to give what may seem like a more trivial example, but something that occurred to me, even in popular culture, I think we can see references to this kind of idea, that there's something out there that's unchangeable. There's something out there that is eternal. There's some kind of order out there that we want to tap into. And I was thinking of, this movie that came out in the mid 20th century, The Wizard of Oz, right? And Dorothy, the actor, or the character in this movie, Dorothy, faces all sorts of difficulties. She's misunderstood. There are tornadoes. There's conflict. And Dorothy sings this song over the rainbow. Somewhere over the rainbow, all right? And somewhere over the rainbow, there's a different world. The skies are always blue. And the things that you hope for come true, right? There's this longing for something that is almost perfect, or actually is perfect. There's a longing for something unchangeable. And I think about this song, and it reminds me, the song Over the Rainbow and The Wizard of Oz, it reminds me of a basic human longing to be tied in to something eternal, to be tied in to a universe, so to say, where there isn't conflict, to be tied in to something perfect. And so we can look, I think, at profound philosophical texts. I think sometimes perhaps we could even look at things in popular culture that remind us of this idea that Augustine's after, that there's something unchangeable out there, and we want to relate ourselves to what is unchangeable. And so Augustine says that a person is at his best when in his whole life he strives toward the unchangeable form of life. The unchangeable form of life. I think that is to say, the perfect form of life. It's interesting that human beings have the capacity to imagine perfection, although they very rarely actually see it. There's no such thing as a perfect relationship, right? I mean, there are relationships that are very, 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 very good, right? But is there really anything, is there anything such as a perfect relationship? A relationship that day in, day out, year after year is perfect. Is there anything like that really at all in the world? Something that is absolutely flawless, absolutely perfect? Well, perhaps, but not much. Human beings don't actually see a lot of real perfection, especially perfection that endures over space of time. And yet human beings have the capacity to imagine such a thing. And I think Augustine would say that's because human beings have the capacity to be tied in to such a thing. There is such a thing as perfection, and it's out there. And the Logos that suffuses the universe, that's what this is. Christians think of Jesus as the perfect human being, that there was one perfect human being. His name was Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, right? And he was the embodiment, as John 1:1 says, of the Logos. There is such a thing as perfection, but it's extremely rare in this world, but yet human beings have the capacity to imagine it. And they have a longing for it. And, again, I realize it's just a song in a movie, but I think that Over the Rainbow, this song in The Wizard of Oz, I think, I just have to, my own mind leads me to think that that song is tapping into this desire human beings have. Well, if there is an unchangeable, perfect realm, and if, as Augustine says, this unchangeable, perfect realm is God, and we can know about that because there's a kind of a force, so to say, emanating from God, the Logos, Ma'at, the Tao, right, expressed in different cultures, right? Then, if all of this is true, then it's in the human being's interest to align him or herself with that. What would the requirements of an unchangeable, perfect realm be? Well, for example, in a perfect, unchangeable realm, presumably, there's no conflict. So if I want to relate myself to that unchangeable, perfect realm, then perhaps I want to do whatever I can in my life to reduce conflict in my own mind, reduce conflict in my own soul, reduce conflict in my own interactions. Perhaps this is what Augustine is getting at. And how is this related to reading and teaching? Because the central ideas of the book, or the central questions of the book is, one, how can I be a good reader of the Bible? Secondly, how can I be a good teacher of the Bible? Or, more basic, how can I be a good reader? How can I be a good teacher? And Augustine is saying, well, a really important thing is to relate our reading to what's unchangeable, our interpretations to what's unchangeable. What things can we discover in what we're reading are related to what's unchangeable? What gems of wisdom can we discover in what we're reading that remind us of what's unchangeable? And when we're teaching, are we teaching for the sake of promotion of the self, or are we teaching for the sake of pointing others to what's unchangeable, to what's perfect? These are, I think, some of the ideas that Augustine is trying to encourage us to think about. So a person is at his best when in his whole life he strives. Notice that language, that's effort, right? Striving. There's effort. Striving toward the unchangeable form of life. Striving toward what's perfect, what's unchangeable. And then we look at the next sentence. If he loves himself on his own account, he does not relate himself to God. That is, if you love yourself on your own account, of course we want to take care of ourselves. We want to be our own good friends, right? We want to treat well the bodies, the minds, the souls that we have. But if we're doing that only for our own selves, well, that can kind of be a problem, right? At least Augustine thinks so. We want to take care of ourselves. We want to take care of our minds. We want to take care of our souls so that we can do a better job of relating ourselves to what's unchangeable and encouraging others to do the same. We don't want to love ourselves just for the sake of loving ourselves because we're changeable. We're passing away. Our lives are fleeting. But if there's something eternal, if there's something unchangeable, well, that's why we want to take care of ourselves. It's in our interest. It's an act of kindness to the self to work to be attached to what's unchangeable. It's an act of hostility to the self to ignore what's unchangeable. Because if I'm only focusing on, if I'm fixated on things that will inevitably go away because this world is completely unchangeable, if I'm completely fixated on those things for their own sake, then that almost seems maybe a little bit like a waste of time. This stuff is going away. But I want to do as well as I can in this world with the energy I have, with the abilities I have. I want to take care of myself. I want to take care of others close to me. I want to guard my soul. I want to help them guard their souls. Why? Because we're self-obsessed? No. Ideally, no. But because we want to work to attach ourselves to what's unchangeable, to what's perfect, right? True self-interest is not selfishness. True self-interest, I think, according to Augustine, is working to strive to attach ourselves to what's unchangeable, right? And so we look at this line again. If a person loves himself on his own account, he does not relate himself to God. It's almost isolated from God, separated from what's unchangeable, but turns to himself, right? Now, what can this mean when it comes to reading, right? Augustine is encouraging us as we're reading, and he's thinking specifically of reading the Bible, as we're reading the Bible, to interpret the text with eternity, to interpret the text with what's with what's unchangeable in mind. But what can a problem be as a reader, not only of the Bible, but as a reader, period? What can a problem be if I'm fixated only on the self, if I'm not fixated on what's unchangeable? Well, let's think about it this way. If I'm reading the text, looking for what in here can point me to the unchangeable, what in here can point me to the perfect, what in here can direct my mind to unchangeable things, then that means I'm giving the text, or I'm allowing the text to exercise power over me. I come to the text and I say, teach me. Teach me. My mind is ready. My mind is open. Right? Not open in a trivial way. I mean, I'm ready to be taught. Right? That's a disposition of humility. We come to the scriptures and say, okay, I'm ready to learn. I'm ready. Speaking to the text, we can almost say, I'm ready for you to teach me. Of course, Augustine says we need the assistance of the Holy Spirit. So we ask the Holy Spirit to point us to what's unchangeable, right? We can do this with the scriptures. I think we can also do this with other great literature. We can come to a genius like Shakespeare, whose insight into human nature was so profound, and we could say, you know, Shakespeare, you're clearly a lot smarter than I am. You're clearly more thoughtful and more insightful than I am. So I'm going to come to your play in the spirit of humility. Teach me. And as you teach me, I want to relate what I'm learning to things that are unchangeable, to truths that are unchangeable. That's the disposition of a person who is striving toward what's unchangeable. But what about this kind of person? The person who loves himself only on account of himself, who's not interested in being attached to things eternal, to things unchangeable. Well, then this person's disposition toward the text can be very different. And that's why I have the phrase up here, power plays. I don't come to the scriptures with a disposition of humility. I come to the scriptures with a disposition of power, right? What's my interpretation of the text? What do I think about this text? What am I going to say about this text? All of those might be good questions, but the first question, I think Augustine is saying, what is this text saying to me? How can this text change me? How can this text teach me? And then I take that, and then I do, take the next step. Because things aren't always clear, we have to interpret. But what we often see in universities, I think especially in universities, we see people pulling power plays over text. They don't approach text, whether it's the Bible or some other document. They don't approach literature in a spirit of humility, saying, what can I learn about what's eternal, what's unchangeable from this text? But we approach text with a disposition of power. What clever thing can I say about this text? How can I promote my own self-image by seeming to say something clever about this text? Right? How can I further my status? How can I further my reputation by seeming so brilliant as I impose myself on this text, as I pull a power play on this text? Well, we have to interpret, obviously. We have to interpret, and there'll be differences of interpretation, so we have discussions. But I think what Augustine is counseling us to do is to approach, of course he's thinking specifically of the Bible, to approach the Bible with a disposition of humility. What is in this text that can point me to the eternal, that can point me to the unchangeable, that can tie me into the Logos, that can tie me into Ma'at, that can tie me into the Tao, right? That's a disposition of humility. And so we can ask ourselves, Is my reading, is my writing, is my speaking, is my teaching, is it aligned with the Logos? Am I striving to align what I do with the unchangeable in the universe, with what's perfect in the universe, right? Am I striving to do that? Am I continually striving to do that in my reading, my writing, my speaking, my teaching? Or am I reading, teaching, speaking, acting, etc., for the promotion of some true good, or am I doing these things mainly or only for the promotion of the self? And as someone who's been in the academic world for over 20 years, there is a lot of this going on. A lot of self-promotion, a lot of status seeking going on. It is very rare that we find smart, intelligent people whose disposition toward literature, whose disposition toward classic texts, even whose disposition toward scripture is one of humility. I want the scriptures to teach me. I want Shakespeare to counsel me. I want to allow Aristotle the room to teach me. There really are certain individuals in history who have put down certain things that really do deserve time and attention. This is true of Augustine's On Christian Teaching. This is a book that has stood the test of time. One generation after another has said this book has certain key insights. Now there are some parts of the book that we can let go. They're extremely hard to understand and don't seem to be relevant today, and Augustine makes some mistakes. There are certain things that we know now that he didn't know. That doesn't take away at all from the fact that he's one of the great geniuses in the history of planet Earth. And so this is one of those books, and we can practice this by approaching his book and saying, Augustine, you clearly are smarter and more insightful than I am. And so I am approaching your book with that recognition. And I'm looking to you to help me see in some new way, in some deeper way, how I can take your advice to strive toward what's unchangeable, to strive toward what's perfect, to strive toward the universe, that part of the universe that is perfect, this force, this emanation from God, this force that we can tap into that points us to what's perfect, what's unchangeable. And the more we can do that, then probably the better off our lives will be. And so Augustine wants to counsel us against pride, against arrogance, against power plays, pulling power plays over text. He wants to counsel humility. Why? Because, at least in the way we've been talking about it here, life goes better that way.